Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into how Native American communities stayed warm inside tipis even when winter fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and how people in other distant places, from Viking halls to medieval castles to Roman street markets, found their own calm ways to live through cold seasons and daily hardship. We'll move slowly through these worlds together, noticing the small details that helped ordinary people stay safe, warm, and quietly resilient. But before you settle in, if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many places and moments gather here together. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. You are walking across open ground that looks at first glance completely still. Snow lies across the prairie in long, pale sheets, stretching farther than your eyes can comfortably follow. The air feels thin and sharp against your face, not quite painful, but alert in a way that keeps you awake. Somewhere above you, the sky is wide and pale blue, the kind of winter sky that seems almost too quiet for sound to travel very far. The temperature has fallen to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. It is cold enough that breath leaves your mouth as a slow cloud, drifting sideways before it disappears. Even the snow beneath your feet does not crunch loudly. It whispers. At first, it seems impossible that anyone could live comfortably here. There are no stone houses rising from the ground, no thick wooden walls, no chimneys trailing smoke into the sky, only the horizon, the wind, and the low movement of white across the land. And then, slowly, you begin to notice shapes. Ahead of you, not far from a gentle bend in the frozen river, a circle of shelters stands quietly together. Their sides slope inward as they rise, narrowing toward the sky in smooth lines that look almost like something grown rather than built. Each one rests lightly on the snow, as if placed there only for a season and ready to leave again when the land changes its mood. This is a winter camp. From a distance, the shelters appear simple. But as you step closer, you begin to understand that simplicity is not the same thing as weakness. The shapes you are seeing have been refined through generations of watching wind move across the plains and snow gather in certain places but not others. The cone-shaped walls do not resist the wind. They guide it upward. You can see this in the way drifting snow gathers around the base of each shelter, but does not pile heavily against the sides. The wind slides along the surface and lifts itself away again, almost politely, as though the structure has quietly explained where it prefers the air to go. Near the edge of the camp, a child moves carefully between two shelters. He is carrying a bundle of firewood in both arms, walking with slow determination across the packed snow path that curves through the circle. The wood is not large. Each piece has already been split and trimmed, so it can burn steadily without wasting heat. He pauses once to adjust his grip, then continues toward a doorway that faces the pale morning horizon. No one hurries him. The camp itself feels arranged around patience. You begin to notice that the doorways of the shelters are not placed randomly. Many of them face toward the east, where the sun rises slowly each morning. This is not only a practical decision, though it does welcome the earliest light and avoids the strongest winter winds that often arrive from other directions. It is also a quiet habit shaped by long memory, repeated often enough that it becomes part of daily life without needing explanation. Beyond the shelters, the frozen river curves through a shallow line of trees. Even in winter, those trees matter. They break the wind before it reaches the camp. They provide branches for fuel and small shelter for animals that might be hunted when food becomes scarce. Long before a single pole was raised here, someone chose this place carefully. Winter on the plains is not survived by accident. As you move closer to the circle of shelters, you begin to notice something else that seems surprising at first. Snow rests lightly along the outer surfaces of the coverings, but it does not melt into wet patches. It sits there quietly, almost as if it belongs. This is not a sign of cold inside the shelters. It is a sign of insulation, working exactly as intended. And buffalo survive winters like this in part because their thick winter coats hold warmth close to their bodies, while keeping snow from melting against their skin. The same material, prepared carefully and stretched across wooden frames, now forms the outer walls of these homes. The hides do not trap dampness. They breathe slowly. They hold warmth without sealing it away too tightly. Even before stepping inside, you begin to understand that these shelters are not fragile tents placed temporarily against the cold. They are carefully shaped companions to the season. The boy with the firewood reaches the entrance of one shelter and disappears through the opening. For a moment, the flap lifts slightly, and you see a narrow ribbon of smoke rising upward through the still air above the roof. It does not spread sideways. It rises in a quiet column, takes steady and controlled. Somewhere inside, a small fire is already awake. Around the circle, faint tracks mark where people have walked repeatedly between shelters, forming gentle paths that connect one household to another. These paths are not straight. They curve slightly, following the natural flow of movement rather than forcing it. Even the shape of walking here has learned to cooperate with winter instead of resisting it. Standing at the edge of the camp, you begin to notice how little noise the wind makes among the shelters themselves. Out on the open prairie, the air moves freely and without interruption. But here, within the circle, the shelters stand close enough together to soften its strength. The camp has created its own small climate, calmer than the land beyond it. Warmth, you begin to realize, is not only something that lives inside a fire, it is something that can be arranged. And as you step closer to one of the sloping walls, you start to wonder how a structure so light, so portable, and so quietly balanced against the snow can hold enough comfort for a family to sleep safely through a night this cold. You step a little closer to the nearest shelter and begin to see something that was not obvious from a distance. The strength of the tipi does not come from thick walls or heavy materials. It begins instead with only 3 poles. Long before the hide covering is lifted into place, 3 carefully chosen lengths of lodgepole pine are raised together and leaned inward until they meet high above the ground. These poles do not stand upright like fence posts. They lean toward one another, each forming a shape that feels balanced rather than forced. This first structure is sometimes called a tripod, though here it feels less like a tool and more like the beginning of a quiet agreement between wood, wind, and gravity. You can imagine the moment when it happens. 3 people stand together on packed snow, lifting the poles slowly into position. One person steadies the base of each pole while another adjusts the angle, watching how the wind presses gently against the wood. When the tops finally meet, they are tied together with a length of sinew or rawhide that holds them firmly but not too tightly. Nothing snaps into place, nothing locks. Instead, the frame settles. Nearby, a woman steps forward and studies the shape for a moment before guiding the next pole into position. She does not hurry. Her hands move with the calm certainty of someone who has done this many times before, someone who already knows how the shelter will stand long before it is finished. The first 3 poles are not simply the beginning of the tipi, they are its spine. Once they are secure, more poles are added one by one, each leaning gently against the others in a slow turning pattern that circles the structure. From above, the arrangement would look almost like a spiral drawn in wood, wrapping itself around the original tripod and spreading the weight evenly toward the ground. This spiral placement is not decorative. It allows the frame to share the pressure of winter winds instead of resisting them in one direction alone. When strong air moves across the plains, it does not strike a single rigid wall. Instead, it passes around the shelter, and the poles carry the force downward through their length into the frozen earth beneath them. The shelter does not fight the wind, it listens to it. Because of this, the frame can bend slightly when the air moves hard across the prairie. It shifts just enough to remain stable, then returns to its resting shape again. A heavier structure might crack under the same pressure. This one simply adjusts itself and waits for the gust to pass. As more poles are added, the circle becomes clearer. Each pole rests at a slightly different angle, and together they create a smooth surface that will soon support the hide covering. Even before that covering is lifted into place, you can already sense how the finished shelter will guide snow downward and allow drifting air to slide upward toward the sky instead of pushing directly against the walls. And not far away, a bundle of additional poles lies ready on the snow. They are long and straight, their surfaces worn smooth by years of travel. These poles are not cut fresh each season. Many of them have moved with the same family across the plains for years, sometimes even for decades. They are carried from one camp to another, tied together and pulled behind dogs or horses on wooden dragging frames that leave thin parallel lines across the winter ground. A shelter like this is not built from disposable pieces. It travels with memory. You can imagine a family recognizing their own poles among many others resting on the snow. A certain curve in the wood, a familiar knot near one end, a place where the bark has been worn away by rope bindings over many winters. Or these small details make the structure feel less like an object and more like a companion that returns each season when it is needed again. The woman guiding the placement of the poles steps back once more and studies the shape that is forming. She tilts her head slightly, watching how the wind moves between the unfinished frame. The openings between the poles are still wide enough for air to pass easily through them, and the movement of that air tells her whether the structure is balanced correctly. If one pole leans too sharply or stands too straight, the pattern changes. She adjusts it gently until the flow feels right again. Around her, others continue working without speaking very much. Someone lifts another pole into place. Someone else presses its base deeper into the packed snow so it will not slip. The movements are quiet and familiar, repeated often enough that they no longer require explanation. Soon the frame stands complete. It does not look heavy or permanent. It does not resemble a fortress or a cabin. Instead, it appears almost like a gathering of tall branches leaning together for warmth. And yet, within this light structure is already the strength needed to hold a covering of buffalo hide against nights that fall to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The strength comes not from thickness, but from cooperation. Each pole supports the others. Each angle shares its weight with the next. Together, they create a shape that allows the shelter to stand steadily, even when the open prairie wind moves across the snow with long, patient force. For a moment, the frame stands uncovered against the pale winter sky. You can see straight through it to the riverbank trees beyond the camp. The air moves softly between the poles, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from nearby fires that have already been lit inside other shelters. Soon the hides will be lifted into place, and the open lattice of wood will disappear behind warm, breathing walls. And as you watch the last pole settle into position beside the others, you begin to understand that what looks simple from a distance is actually the result of many careful decisions made long before this morning ever began. For a little while, the wooden frame stands open to the pale winter sky, its poles leaning together like tall grasses that have paused mid-movement. Then the covering begins to arrive. At first, you notice only the sound. It is a soft dragging sound across packed snow, followed by the quiet lift of heavy material being gathered by careful hands. A large folded hide is carried forward, not hurriedly, but with the steady attention given to something that will soon become the outer wall of a home. The hide is thick, but not stiff. It bends slowly as it moves, shaped by long preparation and by seasons of use before this one. Each piece has already been scraped, dried, softened, and stitched into a larger covering that will wrap around the frame in a single continuous sweep. Nearby, an older woman kneels beside the edge of the hide. She runs her hand along a seam that travels in a long, gentle line from one corner to another. The stitches are tight and even, and made from sinew drawn carefully through small openings that follow the natural strength of the material. She pauses once, smoothing the surface with her palm, checking not only the seam itself, but the direction in which it runs. The seams are not placed at random. They are aligned with the path the wind is expected to follow across the shelter's surface. When strong winter air moves along the hide, It will slide across these stitched lines instead of pressing directly against them. Even the joining of materials has learned how to cooperate with the season. When the hide is lifted higher, several people guide it upward along the wooden frame together. The movement is slow and practiced. No one pulls too quickly. The covering settles into place as though it already knows where it belongs. And as soon the open lattice of poles begins to disappear behind a smooth outer surface that curves gently toward the ground. From the outside, the shelter now looks complete, but what you are seeing is only the first layer of warmth. Buffalo hides are remarkable winter companions. Long before they were shaped into shelter coverings, they protected living animals through storms just as cold as this one. Even when snow rested along their backs for hours, it did not melt quickly into dampness. The warmth beneath remained steady and protected. Now that same quiet protection surrounds the people inside the shelter. The hide does not trap air in a heavy, sealed way. Instead, it allows the walls to breathe slowly. Moisture escapes without carrying warmth away too quickly. Cold air remains outside without pressing sharply inward. The balance is gentle, but very effective. In winter, additional layers may be added inside the shelter, creating a soft pocket of still air between the outer covering and the inner lining. This trapped air becomes part of the warmth itself. It does not move quickly. It rests there, holding heat close in the same patient way that snow rests along the outside surface. Snow, here, is not only an enemy, it is also a quiet helper. You begin to notice how it gathers lightly around the lower edge of the shelter's walls, forming a narrow ridge that seals small openings where wind might otherwise slip inside. The snow does not soak through the hide. It simply settles there, adding another layer between the interior and the open prairie beyond. From a distance, someone unfamiliar with this shelter might assume that snow resting on its surface means the inside must be cold. But the opposite is often true. The snow remains because warmth is being held carefully where it belongs. Near the doorway, the elder who examined the seam earlier now adjusts the lower edge of the covering so it rests smoothly against the ground. She presses the material gently into place with her hands, making sure there are no loose folds where air could gather and push inward during the night. She works without speaking, but her movements carry the quiet certainty of long experience. Around her, others continue fastening the edges of the covering to the poles with short ties of sinew. Each tie is firm but flexible. Nothing is pulled so tight that the shelter cannot move slightly when the wind arrives later. And strength here is never rigid. It always leaves room for adjustment. As the last edges settle into position, the shelter begins to change in another way as well. Sound softens. The open prairie wind that once passed easily between the poles now moves around the outer surface instead. Inside, even before stepping through the entrance, you can imagine the difference. The air will feel calmer there. The space will feel smaller in a comforting way, shaped to hold warmth rather than release it. A narrow opening remains near the top of the shelter, where smoke will soon rise from the fire inside. That opening is intentional, carefully shaped, and never forgotten. Warmth is not created by sealing a shelter completely. It comes from allowing air to move slowly and wisely. The covering itself makes this possible. It bends slightly when touched by the wind, then returns again to its resting shape. It does not resist the weather with stiffness. It answers it with patience. As the final ties are secured and the hide settles fully around the frame, the shelter seems to take on a new presence. It no longer appears like a gathering of poles at all. It looks instead like something grown from the land itself, shaped by the same winter that surrounds it. And as you stand beside the curved wall, watching snow rest quietly along its surface without melting away, you begin to understand that this warmth does not come from thickness alone. It comes from knowing how to borrow the strengths of the animals who once lived here, and letting their protection continue in another form. When the covering settles fully around the wooden frame, the shelter becomes quiet in a new way. The wind is still present outside. You can feel that. It moves across the prairie exactly as it did before, but inside the tipi, something changes almost immediately. The air no longer rushes past your face. It pauses, it gathers itself, and then the fire is lit. At first, the flame is small, A few dry sticks are placed together carefully, not stacked too tightly, not spread too far apart. Someone kneels beside them and breathes gently across their edges until a thin line of smoke begins to rise. The smoke does not wander sideways. It lifts upward in a narrow, steady thread. Soon the fire grows brighter. Its warmth does not spread suddenly. It moves slowly, the way warmth always prefers to travel when it is allowed to follow its natural path. And you begin to notice that the air closest to the fire feels different from the air near the doorway. Near the center, warmth rises softly toward the upper part of the shelter. As it reaches the space beneath the smoke opening, it does not disappear all at once. Instead, part of it drifts outward through the opening, while part of it begins a quiet return journey along the inner walls. This movement is gentle enough that you might miss it if you were not watching carefully. Warm air rises. Then it turns. Then it comes back down again. Between the outer covering and the inner liner of the tipi, there is a narrow hidden space where air can rest without moving quickly. This space acts like a calm pocket, holding warmth in place and guiding it slowly around the shelter's interior surface. Instead of gathering only above the fire, the warmth spreads outward and downward, reaching the edges where people sit and sleep. There are no cold corners waiting quietly in the shadows. The entire space participates in the warmth together. A child sits beside the fire, leaning forward slightly with both hands stretched toward the glowing embers. He is not watching the flames themselves. He is watching the smoke. It rises in a thin ribbon, steady and almost silent, moving upward toward the opening above. For a moment, the ribbon bends slightly as a small change in wind passes across the shelter's roof. Then it straightens again and continues its slow climb toward the sky. Above him, the smoke flaps at the top of the shelter, shift just enough to guide the smoke outward without allowing the wind to enter too strongly. These flaps are not fixed in place. They can be adjusted from below using long, slender poles, allowing the direction of the opening to change as the wind changes. Even on a night that falls to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, the shelter continues breathing quietly through this opening. Fresh air enters near the lower edges of the walls where it cannot disturb the sleeping spaces. It moves slowly toward the center of the shelter, warming as it approaches the fire. Then it rises, carrying smoke upward and away. Nothing rushes, nothing swirls sharply. The movement is steady enough that people inside soon stop noticing it at all. Along the lower edge of the liner, you can feel a faint difference in temperature, where the incoming air passes gently upward. It does not feel like a draft across your feet. It feels more like the coolness of a shaded place on a summer afternoon, present but not uncomfortable. The liner itself plays an important role in this quiet circulation. Without it, warm air rising from the fire would escape too quickly toward the opening above. With it, the warmth pauses long enough to travel outward and downward before leaving the shelter. The liner teaches the air where to go. It does not trap the warmth, it guides it. As the fire settles into a steady rhythm of glowing coals and soft flame, the interior of the shelter becomes calmer still. Shadows move slowly along the curved walls. The smell of wood smoke remains light and familiar, rather than heavy or sharp. People sitting along the edges of the shelter lean comfortably against rolled bedding and folded hides. The warmest air has already reached them. Even the ground beneath them feels less severe now, softened by layers placed carefully between the frozen earth and the living space above it. Outside, the wind continues its long journey across the plains. Inside, the air moves differently. It rises, pauses, and returns again, like a quiet conversation that never quite ends. The child beside the fire watches the smoke ribbon once more as it disappears through the opening above. For a moment, he lifts one hand toward it, not close enough to touch, only close enough to feel its warmth passing gently upward. And as you sit there with him, noticing how evenly the warmth has spread through the shelter without any sudden movement or sharp drafts, you begin to understand that the fire alone is not what keeps this space comfortable through such a cold night. And it is the path the warmth has been given to follow. Before the first pole is lifted into place, before the hide covering is unfolded, before even a small bundle of firewood is gathered, something else happens quietly and almost invisibly. Someone chooses where the shelter will stand. It is an easy detail to overlook, especially when looking at a finished winter camp from a distance. The circle of tipis appears calm and natural, as though it has simply settled where it wished. But each shelter rests exactly where it does because someone studied the land first. You can imagine a man walking slowly along the frozen edge of a river earlier that morning. The snow there lies differently from the snow on the open prairie. It gathers in softer ridges, shaped by the sheltering presence of trees. Even without touching the ground, he can see where the wind has been strongest and where it has already begun to lose its force. He pauses beside a line of cottonwood trunks, rising pale against the winter sky. From this place, he looks outward across the open plain, watching how the drifting snow moves along the surface. The wind does not travel in straight lines. It bends, it slows, it circles low hills and gathers itself again in open stretches. These patterns are familiar to him. He does not need instruments to measure them. He reads them the way others might read footprints along a path. When he returns to the rest of the camp, the place for the shelters has already been decided. Winter camps are rarely set in the middle of exposed ground if another choice exists. A shallow valley, a curve in a riverbank, or even a scattered line of trees can soften the movement of the air, enough to make a long night feel different. The cold remains the same in number, still falling to -30 degrees Celsius, which is about -22 degrees Fahrenheit. But the experience of that cold changes when the wind loses its edge. Soon the first tripod of poles rises exactly where it should. As the rest of the frame takes shape, another decision quietly guides the work. The doorway is not left to chance. Most entrances face toward the east. At first, this may seem like a small habit, something repeated simply because it has always been done that way. But when you stand beside the doorway at dawn, the reason becomes easier to understand. The first light of morning reaches the opening directly. It enters the shelter before the day has fully begun, all warming the air gently after the long, cold hours of night. At the same time, the strongest winter winds often arrive from other directions across the plains. By turning the doorway away from those winds, the shelter avoids allowing sharp gusts to move directly inside. The doorway becomes both a greeting and a protection. You begin to notice how the snow itself reveals these choices long after they are made. Outside the camp, the snow lies unevenly across the open ground, shaped into long, shallow ridges that point in the direction the wind has traveled. But within the circle of shelters, the snow rests more quietly. It gathers in softer patterns, interrupted by the curved walls and the careful spacing between them. The camp has already begun to create its own small stillness. A child walking between the shelters leaves a narrow trail of footprints that curve gently rather than running straight across the open space. Even the paths people choose to walk follow the calmer air inside the circle. Nothing here is arranged in straight lines, unless it needs to be. Near the edge of the riverbank, the hunter who studied the wind earlier now kneels beside a drift of snow that has formed along the base of a shelter wall. He presses his mittened hand lightly against it, feeling how firmly it has settled there. Snow like this is not only something to brush away, it becomes part of the shelter itself. As the drift gathers along the lower edge of the covering, it seals small openings where moving air might otherwise slip beneath the wall. The snow does not feel heavy, it feels helpful. It is as though the land itself has leaned closer to assist the shelter in keeping warmth where it belongs. From inside the camp, the wind sounds different now. It still moves across the plains beyond the river, but here its voice has softened. It passes around the shelters rather than between them. The circle of homes shapes the air just enough to make the night more comfortable than the open land alone would allow. This quiet shaping of the landscape is not something that happens by accident. It is the result of generations of watching how winter behaves, learning where it presses hardest and where it loosens its grip. Over time, these observations become habits, and those habits become something even calmer than knowledge. They become instinct. As you stand near one of the doorways and look toward the faint light beginning to gather along the eastern horizon, you begin to understand that warmth inside the shelter does not begin with fire. It begins with direction, and somewhere above the roofline, where the smoke opening waits beneath the sky, The wind is already shifting slightly, preparing to test the shelter's breathing in a new way as evening returns again. As evening settles across the winter camp, the light changes first. The sky softens from pale blue into a quiet gray that rests gently over the open plains. Snow begins to reflect what little light remains, and the shelters seem to glow faintly along their curved sides, as though holding the last warmth of the day close for later. Inside the tipi, the fire has already settled into a steady rhythm. The taller flames from earlier have lowered themselves into a bed of glowing embers, and above them, the smoke continues its calm journey upward toward the opening at the top of the shelter. It moves in a narrow column, neither rushing nor spreading, as though it already knows the path it is meant to follow. Near the doorway, a woman reaches for a long, slender pole resting against the wall. She lifts it easily and turns her attention upward. At the very top of the shelter, two triangular flaps of hide extend outward on either side of the smoke opening. They are small compared to the rest of the covering, but they hold a quiet responsibility. With only a slight movement, they can change the way air travels through the entire space. The woman raises the pole and touches one flap gently, though it shifts a little to the side. Outside, the wind has changed direction since afternoon. It now arrives from farther north, moving across the open prairie in a slower but colder stream. By turning the flap toward this new movement, she allows the rising smoke to leave the shelter without inviting the wind to follow it inward. The shelter adjusts its breathing without anyone needing to speak about it. Nearby, a child watches her work with quiet attention. He has seen this done many times before. He knows that when the smoke begins to lean slightly to one side as it rises, it means the flaps will soon move again. He also knows that this small change will make the sleeping spaces along the walls feel warmer before the night grows deeper. The smoke flaps are not decorations, they are tools. With them, the opening at the top of the shelter can face toward the wind or away from it, depending on what the evening requires. If the opening faces the wind directly, the smoke escapes quickly, but cold air may follow. If it turns slightly aside, the smoke continues to rise while the cold remains outside. Each adjustment is small. Together, they shape the comfort of the entire night. Along the inside of the wall, the liner continues its quiet work as well. It hangs a short distance away from the outer covering, creating a narrow space where warm air can gather before drifting downward again. This hidden space does not look important at first glance. It appears to be only a second layer of hide, but without it, the warmth from the fire would rise too quickly toward the opening above and disappear into the winter sky. With it, the warmth pauses long enough to travel across the shelter before leaving. Near the ground, you can feel another movement taking place. Though it is even more subtle, fresh air enters slowly beneath the lower edge of the covering, where it cannot disturb the people sitting or lying along the walls. It moves inward almost invisibly, warming itself as it approaches the center of the shelter. By the time it rises toward the smoke opening, it has already become part of the interior air. Nothing arrives suddenly. Nothing leaves too quickly. The shelter breathes the way a living thing breathes when it is calm. The woman lowers the pole again and rests it beside the doorway. For a moment, she watches the smoke ribbon above the fire to make sure it continues rising smoothly. Satisfied, she turns toward the bedding arranged along the wall and begins spreading an additional layer of hide where one of the children will soon lie down. Even this small action follows the same quiet understanding as the movement of the smoke flaps. Warmth is guided. It is not forced. Outside, the wind moves across the camp circle in long, steady lines. When it reaches the curved walls of the shelters, it bends slightly and continues its journey around them. Only a small portion of its strength reaches the opening above, and even that is softened by the careful angle of the flaps. Inside, the air remains steady. The fire glows, the smoke rises, and along the lower edge of the liner, the faintest movement of warmer air begins to gather where people will soon sleep. You begin to understand that these adjustments are not made once and forgotten. They continue through the evening. If the wind shifts again after midnight, someone may rise quietly to move the flaps once more. No one speaks about it as a special task. It is simply part of caring for the shelter. the same way one might add another small piece of wood to the fire before returning to rest. Above the roofline, the smoke now lifts almost straight upward into the darkening sky. From outside, the shelter appears still and silent beneath the first faint stars of evening. But inside, a gentle conversation continues between warmth, air, and hide walls that respond together without hurry. And as the night deepens across the plains, you begin to notice how this small opening above the fire quietly decides whether the shelter will feel close and comfortable or wide and restless before morning comes. By the time evening settles completely over the camp, the inside of the shelter begins to change again. The fire at the center has already shaped the air into a slow and steady warmth. But now the people inside begin shaping the space itself. Blankets are lifted, hides are unfolded. Small objects are moved quietly from one place to another. Each motion, part of a pattern older than anyone present can easily remember. You begin to notice that no one prepares to sleep near the center of the shelter. The warmest place is not where the fire burns. It is where the warmth arrives after it has traveled. Around the curved edge of the interior wall, bedding is laid in a wide circle. Each place along this circle has already been softened by layers placed carefully between the frozen earth below and the sleeping bodies that will soon rest above it. First come woven mats or grasses gathered earlier in the season. Over them lie folded hides, thick enough to hold warmth, but flexible enough to move easily when morning returns. The ground beneath the shelter never truly stops being cold, but these layers teach it how to behave more gently. Near the wall, the air feels different from the air near the doorway. It is steadier there, less touched by the slow movement of fresh air entering along the lower edge of the covering. The warmth that rose earlier from the fire has already traveled outward and downward along the liner, settling quietly where people now prepare their sleeping places. Then it is a little like the way soup continues to hold heat longest along the sides of a bowl after the center has begun to cool. No one explains this aloud. Everyone already knows. A grandmother kneels beside one of the bedding places, smoothing the edge of a folded hide with both hands. She presses the material gently against the liner wall so that no small openings remain where air might slip through during the night. Her movements are careful but unhurried, as though she is finishing a task she has completed many winters before. Nearby, a pair of boots rests close enough to the fire that their stiff leather will soften before morning. The warmth reaches them slowly, drawing moisture away without scorching them. No one places the boots too close. That distance is known without measuring. Above the bedding circle, its several small bundles hang from the wooden poles that form the shelter's frame. These bundles contain tools, clothing, and small supplies that must remain dry and easy to reach. Hanging them above the ground keeps them away from dampness and allows air to move freely beneath them. Even storage follows the path of warmth. Nothing heavy blocks the flow of air along the walls. Nothing interrupts the slow movement that carries heat from the center, outward and back again. The shelter continues breathing, and everything inside it is arranged so that this breathing remains easy. Across the fire, a visitor has already been given a place to sit. It is not chosen at random. Guests are welcomed along the circle in positions that reflect courtesy and familiarity. Close friends sit nearer the family's usual places. Elders are offered spaces where the warmth is steady and the light from the fire is clear. Children settle wherever they can lean comfortably against someone they trust. No one needs to discuss these arrangements. They happen quietly, the way water settles into the shape of the ground beneath it. As the grandmother finishes smoothing the bedding, she pauses to adjust a small folded bundle near the wall. Inside it are additional layers that may be needed later in the night, when the temperature outside falls again toward minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. She places the bundle within easy reach, then rests her hand briefly against the liner, as though checking the calmness of the air beside it. The liner remains warm, not hot, not cold, simply steady. Across the shelter, someone adds another small piece of wood to the fire. The flames rise for a moment and then settle again into glowing embers that send warmth outward in slow, patient waves. Shadows move gently along the curved walls, touching the hanging bundles and the folded bedding before returning to the center once more. Children begin to lie down along the edge of the circle, their heads turned toward the firelight. Their voices grow quieter as blankets are drawn upward around their shoulders. The warmth they feel does not come only from the embers. It comes from the careful arrangement of the entire space around them. The shelter itself has prepared a place for sleep. The grandmother lowers herself onto her own bedding place last. Before she settles completely, she reaches once more toward the boots near the fire and turns them slightly so both will dry evenly through the night. It is a small adjustment, almost invisible in the firelight, but it completes the circle of quiet preparations that began when the bedding was first unfolded. Around her, the shelter holds its warmth evenly. Nothing rushes, nothing drifts sharply. The air remains calm along the walls, just where everyone has chosen to rest. And as voices soften into low conversation and blankets settle into stillness, you begin to notice that stories, like warmth, travel most easily along the edges of the circle where everyone can share them together. As the fire settles into a steady glow and the bedding circle grows still, the shelter becomes quieter in a different way. Yet no one announces that the evening has begun. It simply arrives. Outside, the wind continues moving across the plains in long, patient currents. Inside, the air remains calm along the liner walls where everyone rests. The warmth gathered earlier now lingers evenly through the shelter, touching each sleeping place in turn before returning again toward the center. And with that warmth comes something else: voices. At first they are low and scattered, only small exchanges between people adjusting blankets or shifting closer to the fire. Someone asks for another piece of wood. Someone else answers without raising their voice. The sounds are soft enough that they blend easily with the quiet crackling of embers. Then one voice continues longer than the others. An elder sitting near the fire begins to speak. He does not raise his voice. He does not change his posture. He simply begins describing a journey that took place many winters before, when the snow gathered earlier than expected and the herds turned farther south than usual. As he speaks, his finger moves slowly through the air, tracing a curved path that only he can see clearly, but that the others recognize immediately. He is describing where the river bends beneath a low ridge, where the wind breaks behind a stand of cottonwood trees, where the crossing remains safe even when ice forms along the edges. These are not stories told only for entertainment. They are maps. Children listening from their bedding places follow the movement of his hand carefully. They may not travel those same routes for several years, but they are already learning them now. Each remembered path becomes part of a quiet collection of knowledge carried forward from one winter to another. The shelter itself helps hold these memories. The curved walls keep voices close. Words do not drift away into the open prairie. They move around the circle slowly, the way warmth does, reaching each listener before fading. Nearby, another pair of hands begins working with a strip of softened hide. A woman threads a slender bone needle through its surface, drawing sinew carefully behind it. The needle moves with a small, dry sound each time it passes through the material. The sound is steady and unhurried, joining the rhythm of the fire and the elder's voice without interrupting either one. Winter evenings are not empty hours. They are repair time. Clothing worn thin during autumn hunts is strengthened again. And straps used to tie bundles to traveling frames are checked for weakness. Small tiers and coverings are closed before they grow larger. Every quiet movement of the needle protects someone from cold that has not yet arrived. Across the shelter, another person examines the edge of a wooden tool handle, smoothing it gently with a piece of stone. No sparks rise. No loud scraping breaks the calm. Only a faint brushing sound marks the work being done. Children watching these movements learn as much from silence as from explanation. They see where tools are stored. They see how hides are folded. They see how firewood is placed so it will burn evenly through the night without wasting warmth. Nothing needs to be announced. Everything is demonstrated. As the elder continues tracing remembered routes in the air, he pauses once to describe a place where storms sometimes gather unexpectedly. The children shift slightly under their blankets, listening more closely now. Storm paths are important knowledge. Knowing where wind turns suddenly across open ground can mean the difference between comfort and danger when traveling later in the season. Stories like this are repeated often, not because people forget them, but because remembering together makes them stronger. Along the wall, the grandmother who arranged the bedding earlier now adds another small piece of wood to the fire. The flames rise briefly and then settle again into a steady glow that reaches the edges of the shelter without growing too bright. She watches the smoke drift upward for a moment before returning to her place along the liner. The shelter continues holding sound the way it holds warmth. Nothing echoes sharply. Nothing disappears quickly. Each voice travels gently across the circle before coming to rest. The elder lowers his hand at last, his story reaching its quiet end. For a moment, no one speaks. The only sound comes from the bone needle passing once more through softened hide. Then another voice begins. This time, it belongs to someone younger, repeating part of the path just described, tracing the route again in simpler words so the children can follow it easily. In this way, knowledge moves from one generation to the next without needing written marks or drawn maps. It travels by listening, it travels by remembering, and it travels most easily on nights when the shelter is warm enough for everyone to remain still and attentive together. Outside, or the wind continues its long movement across the plains. But inside the circle of hides and poles, another journey is already being prepared. Because before many days pass, the camp itself may need to follow those remembered routes once again. Morning arrives earlier than expected, not because the sun rises quickly, but because movement begins before its light reaches the camp. Inside the shelter, the fire has already burned down to a shallow bed of ash and faint red coals. Someone wakes first and listens for a moment before standing. The air still feels warm along the liner walls, but outside, the wind has changed again. Its sound is sharper now, moving across the frozen ground with a direction that suggests travel will soon be necessary. The decision to move does not come suddenly. It arrives the way weather arrives, slowly at first, then clearly enough that everyone understands. Before long, the bedding circle begins to open. Blankets are folded carefully, hides are rolled inward rather than outward, protecting their softer surfaces from frost. Nothing is hurried. The shelter that held warmth through the night is treated with the same patience as when it was first raised. A child steps outside and notices the snow has shifted slightly around the edges of the camp. The drifts that once leaned gently against the lower walls now curve differently, showing that the wind has begun pressing from another direction. These small changes are enough to confirm what the adults already sensed before sunrise. Today will be a travel day. Near the doorway, one of the long lodgepole pine poles is lowered first. It does not fall. Then it is guided downward slowly, lifted free from the frame, and laid carefully along the snow beside the shelter. Soon, another follows, and then another, until the shape that stood so firmly through the night begins to open again into separate pieces that can move with the people who depend on them. The 3 poles that formed the original foundation are lowered last. Even now, they are treated with special attention. These poles are familiar companions. Some have traveled with the same family across many seasons of grass and snow. Their surfaces carry marks left by rope bindings from earlier journeys, faint traces that remain visible even after years of use. A father pauses beside one of them for a moment before lifting it. He adjusts his grip slightly, recognizing its balance without needing to test it. These poles are not replaced each year, they are remembered. Nearby, the hide covering is folded inward in long, careful sections. The seams that face the wind during the night are turned safely toward the center as the material is rolled, protecting them from strain during travel. Folding follows a pattern just as precise as raising the shelter itself. Each movement prepares the covering for the next time it will be needed. Soon the curved walls that held warmth only hours before have become a compact bundle resting quietly on the snow. Children gather close as the poles are tied together in pairs. 2 long poles are fastened at one end and allowed to spread slightly apart at the other, forming a simple dragging frame that will carry supplies across the winter ground. This frame slides smoothly over snow and frozen grass. Ole leaving narrow parallel lines behind it as it moves. Dogs are already waiting nearby, their breath visible in small clouds as they shift their weight against their harnesses. For generations, dogs carried these loads before horses became common across the plains. Even after horses arrived, dogs continued helping with lighter bundles, especially in deep snow, where their smaller bodies moved more easily. One child climbs carefully onto a lightly loaded dragging frame and sits there for a moment while an older sibling adjusts the bundle beneath him. The ride will not last long, but it makes the journey feel different, turning travel into something that belongs to everyone, rather than only the adults who guide it. Across the camp, other families are preparing in similar ways. Bundles of tools are tied securely. Cooking vessels are wrapped inside folded hides. Small personal objects disappear into traveling packs that will be carried across the open prairie before midday. Nothing is left behind. The shelter itself is not abandoned. It travels. As the last poles are lifted and fastened into place, the open space where the tipi stood only hours earlier begins to look unfamiliar. The circle of homes that soften the wind through the night is already becoming a pattern of tracks leading outward across the snow. But the knowledge of how to rebuild the shelter has not disappeared with it. It moves with the people. The family that prepared their poles first now begins walking toward the edge of the frozen riverbank. The dragging frames follow behind them in long, steady lines, and sliding across the snow with a quiet sound that resembles the movement of animals crossing open ground together. Travel like this does not feel like leaving home. It feels like carrying home forward. Ahead of them, the horizon remains wide and pale beneath the winter sky. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, another sheltered place waits where the poles will rise again. The hides will unfold once more, and the warmth of the shelter will return as naturally as it did before. And as you watch the last bundle disappear slowly into the brightness of morning snow, you begin to understand why some newcomers to the plains found it difficult to imagine a house that could walk away without losing its strength. Far from the moving circles of the winter camp, another kind of shelter stands alone on the open prairie. And it does not travel. It does not bend with the wind. It waits. From a distance, the cabin appears strong in a way that feels familiar to people who come from forested lands. Its walls are made from horizontal logs, stacked carefully one above another, their weight pressing downward into the frozen ground beneath them. Snow gathers along the roof and remains there until the sun returns weeks later to loosen its hold. A narrow chimney rises above the roof. From it, a thin line of smoke drifts sideways across the pale morning sky. The shelter is quiet, but not in the same way as the TV circle. This quiet feels heavier. Inside the cabin, warmth must be created differently. The fire burns along the walls rather than in the center. Its heat spreads out slowly, in touching nearby surfaces first, traveling further across the interior. A thick wood walls became difficult to find. Instead of logs, they cut thick blocks of prairie earth and stacked them into walls that held warmth more steadily. These sod houses rested low against the ground, their surfaces blending almost completely with the surrounding land once winter snow settled over them. From a distance, they looked less like houses and more like gentle rises in the earth itself. Inside, the soil walls absorbed warmth slowly and released it slowly, creating a steadier air through the night. Even so, these shelters required careful maintenance. Their roofs had to be checked after heavy snowfall. Their walls needed repair when spring rains returned. Every shelter carried its own conversation with the landscape. Far to the north, in forests where tall trees grew close together, another tradition shaped wooden homes differently. Scandinavian builders fitted logs tightly at their corners so that wind found fewer places to enter. Their cabins held warmth more evenly because the forests around them supplied both materials and protection from open prairie winds. When these builders traveled westward into lands where trees stood far apart, they brought their knowledge with them. But the plains asked different questions. Here, fuel was harder to gather. Here, the wind traveled farther without stopping. Here, movement sometimes mattered more than permanence. The settler beside the cabin lifts another armful of split wood and carries it indoors. As he closes the door behind him, the sound of the wind fades slightly, though not completely. The shelter holds its shape against the cold with determination rather than flexibility. It protects by standing firm. It does not guide the air the way the curved hide walls of the tipi once did. Both shelters keep people safe. Both shelters answer winter in their own language. Yet, as you watch the thin line of smoke drift sideways from the chimney into the morning sky, you begin to understand why another winter tradition, far to the north in long timber halls lit by fire and story, found a different way to meet the darkest season of the year. Far to the north of the open plains, winter arrives differently. Here, the land does not stretch outward in long, pale horizons. Instead, forests gather close together, their branches holding snow in heavy silence. The sky lowers itself toward the earth earlier each afternoon, and daylight becomes something brief and precious, arriving late and leaving quickly again. In these northern lands, people measure winter not only by cold, but by darkness. As the season deepens, the sun begins rising later each morning until it barely lifts above the horizon at all. Its light travels low across the sky, never climbing high enough to warm the frozen ground beneath it. Then, slowly, almost without warning, the days stop growing shorter. For a moment that cannot be seen directly but can be felt by everyone watching the sky, the darkness reaches its longest point. This is the time of midwinter. It arrives when the sun seems to hesitate before beginning its return, and people gather together inside wooden halls to wait for the light to come back again. A child stands near the doorway of one such hall, watching the last pale glow of afternoon settle along the threshold. Frost spreads slowly across the wooden surface beneath his boots, forming delicate white patterns that catch what little light remains. He waits there quietly, not because anyone has asked him to, but because this is the evening when the darkness feels deepest. Inside the hall, the fire has already been burning for hours, and its warmth spreads outward from a long central hearth, touching the timber walls and rising toward the rafters where smoke escapes through an opening in the roof. The air smells of wood smoke and pine resin, familiar scents that make the long night easier to accept. Evergreen branches hang along the interior beams above him. They were brought inside not only because they remain green when other plants have faded, but because they remind everyone that life continues even when the fields outside lie silent beneath snow. Their scent mixes with the smoke and the warmth of the hall, creating a feeling that winter has not taken everything away. This evening marks the beginning of Yule. The word itself carries the memory of turning, of a wheel shifting direction at last after rolling slowly toward darkness for many weeks. People do not gather only to celebrate warmth. They gather to notice the moment when the sun begins its quiet return. In lands where winter can stretch across many months, this change matters deeply. Inside the hall, families sit close together along wooden benches arranged beside the fire. The flames move steadily, sending shifting light across carved pillars and hanging tools that rest along the walls. No one needs to speak loudly. The sound of the fire itself fills the space comfortably. Outside, the sky grows darker. Inside, the hall grows brighter. Candles are lit one by one, their small flames joining the larger fire at the center of the room. Each light seems modest by itself, but together they create a steady glow that reaches every corner of the hall. Even the rafters above begin to reflect the warmth. For people living this far north, light is never taken for granted. During midwinter, it becomes something to gather and protect. The child at the doorway steps inside at last, brushing frost from his sleeves as he moves closer to the fire. Someone nearby shifts slightly to make space for him along the bench. No one comments on his silence. Everyone understands the feeling of waiting that comes with this evening. The fire continues burning as the hall fills with quiet conversation. Some speak about the length of the winter so far. Others speak about the returning sun that will soon begin climbing higher each day, even if the change remains almost invisible at first. These conversations are not hurried. They move slowly, like the light itself returning step by step across the sky. Above the fire, any smoke drifts upward through the roof opening and disappears into the night air. Beyond the walls, the stars have already begun to appear. They shine more clearly now than they did earlier in the season, their brightness sharpened by the cold. People stepping outside for a moment can see them stretching across the sky in steady patterns that do not change even when the days grow shorter. Those patterns remind them that winter is not endless. The sky itself carries reassurance. Inside the hall, evergreen branches remain fresh above the benches. Their color does not fade, even as snow deepens outside. They stand quietly as a promise that spring will return, though no one expects it soon. For now, the important thing is simply to wait together. As the candles burn steadily beside the central fire, their small flames reflect along the polished surfaces of wooden cups resting nearby. The light moves gently across the room, touching faces, tools, and beams in equal measure. It is enough. And as you sit there beside the warmth of the longhouse fire, listening to the quiet conversations that fill the hall during the longest night of the year, you begin to sense that this gathering is only the beginning of something larger, still waiting to unfold before morning comes. Inside the longhouse, the fire has already been burning for many hours when the evening begins to change. At first, it is only a shift in movement. Someone brings additional wood forward and places it carefully onto the embers. Someone else carries a large wooden vessel closer to the benches where families sit together. No announcement marks the moment, yet everyone present understands that the quiet waiting of midwinter is giving way to something more deliberate now. The feast is beginning. Along the length of the hall, carved drinking horns are lifted from hooks or passed from hand to hand. Their polished surfaces catch the firelight as they move, reflecting small bands of gold and amber across the wooden walls. Each horn holds mead, a drink made from honey and water that has been allowed to rest and change slowly over time. Its sweetness carries warmth of a different kind. When the horns are raised together, no one drinks quickly. The first sips come slowly, shared as part of a rhythm that belongs to the season itself. Midwinter is not a time for haste. It is a time for remembering that survival through darkness depends on remaining close to one another. Near the center of the hall, a large wooden platter is carried forward and placed beside the fire. Upon it rests the roasted form of a winter boar. The animal is more than food. For many families across the northern lands, the boar carries meaning connected to the god Freyr, whose presence was associated with fertility, growth, and the returning strength of the earth after winter loosens its hold. To share this meal together is to recognize that even in the coldest season, the promise of renewal has not disappeared. Children watch as portions are divided carefully. No one reaches forward too soon. The sharing follows a pattern that reflects both respect and memory. Each serving passes from hand to hand before it is eaten, allowing everyone to participate in the quiet agreement that binds the hall together during the longest nights of the year. Near one of the carved pillars, a young warrior rises slowly from his place. He does not step forward immediately. Instead, he reaches first toward a ring resting beside the fire. The ring is made of metal, worn smooth by many hands over many winters. It lies within easy reach, so that promises spoken beside it will be remembered clearly. He places his hand upon it. The hall grows quieter. Oaths spoken during midwinter carry particular weight. This is a season when uncertainty feels close, when storms may still arrive without warning, and when the strength of a community depends on trust that extends beyond a single household. Promises made now are meant to last beyond the cold. The young warrior speaks calmly. His voice does not rise above the sound of the fire. He describes the journey he intends to make when the season turns again toward spring, and the support he will offer to those who travel with him. His words are simple, but they are not casual. When he finishes, he lowers his hand from the ring and returns to his place along the bench. Others may speak later, or they may not. The important thing is that the opportunity exists. Nearby, another drinking horn is passed quietly to an older woman seated beside the fire. Before she drinks, she pauses for a moment and speaks a short remembrance of relatives who shared this hall in earlier winters, but are no longer present now. No one interrupts her. The remembrance belongs to everyone listening. In this way, the feast stretches backward as well as forward. The warmth of the fire joins the warmth of memory. Above the benches, evergreen branches remain fastened along the beams, their scent still fresh despite the long night outside. Smoke continues drifting upward through the roof opening, carrying with it the quiet sounds of conversation that fill the hall more fully now. The darkness beyond the walls has not changed, yet inside, the feeling of waiting has softened. Mead passes from hand to hand again. The roasted meat is shared until only the scent of it remains beside the fire. Children grow quieter as the evening deepens, leaning against parents and older siblings, while listening to voices that rise and fall in gentle patterns around them. The young warrior who spoke earlier rests his hands loosely on his knees, watching the flames move across the hearthstones. His promise now belongs to the hall as much as to himself. It will be remembered when the snow begins to melt and travel becomes possible again. Around him, others continue speaking in low voices, sometimes repeating stories that have been told many times before, sometimes adding small details that make those stories feel new again. Each word strengthens the sense that no one faces the long winter alone. Outside, the stars continue shining above the snow-covered roofs. Inside, the fire burns steadily beside the oath ring, where promises have already begun shaping the seasons ahead. And as the drinking horns pass quietly once more from one pair of hands to another, you begin to notice that while feasts like this fill the hall with warmth and certainty, there are still others nearby who remain awake beyond the walls, yet keeping watch through the same winter night. Outside the warmth of the longhouse, winter feels sharper again. The forest has thinned into open ground, and above the ground rises a different kind of shelter altogether. Stone walls stand high against the horizon, their surfaces pale beneath a thin covering of frost. Narrow towers rise above them at careful intervals, watching the countryside in every direction at once. This is a castle at night. Its gates are closed, its windows glow faintly, and high above the sleeping courtyards below, a single guard walks slowly along the wall. His boots make a quiet scraping sound against the frozen stone beneath them. Each step leaves a faint print that hardens almost immediately in the cold air. When he pauses near the corner of a tower, the sound of his movement fades into the wind that passes steadily across the battlements. Winter does not feel the same here as it does on the open plains. Stone does not bend, stone does not breathe. It holds the cold in place. The guard pauses beside a small iron brazier, resting along the inner edge of the wall walk. Inside it, a handful of glowing coals provides a modest circle of warmth, just large enough for him to warm his fingers before continuing his round. He holds his hands above the heat for a moment, then turns again toward the darkness beyond the gate. His task is not to fight. It is to watch. Throughout the night, guards like him move in slow patterns along the walls and towers of the castle. Their shifts are divided into quiet portions marked by the sounding of bells from within the courtyard below. Each bell signals that one group of watchers may rest while another takes their place along the wall. In this way, the night is shared. No one remains awake alone for its entire length. The bells do not ring loudly enough to disturb the people sleeping inside the castle. They sound only far enough to guide those who must remain alert. Each tone travels upward through the cold air and settles gently along the stone passages where guards wait for their turn to walk again. The guard resumes his path. From the height of the wall, he can see beyond the frozen fields surrounding the castle. Snow lies across the open ground in pale sheets that reflect the faint light of the moon. No movement appears there tonight. No travelers approach the gate. No signal fires burn along the distant hills. Still, he continues watching. Danger does not always arrive with warning. Sometimes it comes quietly. Sometimes it begins inside the walls rather than beyond them. He reaches the next tower and pauses again, looking down into the courtyard below. Most windows are dark now. Only a few narrow bands of light remain, where servants finish their evening tasks, or where someone keeps a small fire burning through the coldest hours before dawn. From here, the castle appears peaceful. Yet the guard knows that watch duty includes more than looking outward. He listens as well. The sound of footsteps in the wrong place at the wrong time can matter as much as movement beyond the gate. The opening of a door that should remain closed, the shifting of a chain that should remain still. Even the absence of expected sounds can carry meaning during the deep hours of night. The wind moves across the tower again, pressing gently against his cloak. He adjusts it closer around his shoulders and continues walking. Along the inner wall passage, another guard approaches from the opposite direction. They exchange a few quiet words as they pass, confirming that all remains calm along their sections of the wall. No long conversation follows. Each returns to his own stretch of stone and shadow. Below them, somewhere inside the castle, another bell sounds softly. The next portion of the night has begun. Soon a different pair of watchers will take their place along the gatehouse. Others will move to the towers facing the northern fields. Still others will remain near the inner courtyard, listening for signs of disturbance among the sleeping households gathered inside the walls. Watch duty is never still. Even when nothing happens, it continues. The guard returns once more to the brazier and pauses briefly beside its fading coals. He adds a small piece of charcoal from a nearby pouch and watches as the glow strengthens again. The warmth spreads slowly through his fingers before he turns back toward the outer wall. Above him, the sky is clear. Stars shine sharply against the cold darkness, their light steady enough to guide his path along the narrow walkway without need for a torch. The stone beneath his boots reflects that faint light in pale lines that mark the edge of the battlement. Far below, the heavy wooden gate remains closed and silent. No one approaches it tonight. Yet the guard remains where he is, listening to the wind moving along the towers and across the frozen fields beyond. Because sometimes, yet even in the quietest hours of winter, the danger a castle fears most begins not beyond its walls, but somewhere inside them. The castle gate is never only a doorway. Even in daylight, it is a place of attention. At night, it becomes something quieter and more watchful still. You walk beneath its heavy arch slowly, noticing how the air changes as soon as you pass inside the outer passage. The stone above your head feels closer here than the open sky along the wall walk. Sound moves differently as well. Footsteps echo softly along the narrow floor before fading into the darkness ahead. Lantern light travels carefully through this space. It does not spread far. Instead, it gathers in small pools along the walls, touching iron hinges and wooden beams before settling again into shadow. The passage is not meant to feel wide or welcoming. It is meant to slow movement and invite observation. Above you, unseen but carefully positioned, small openings look down into the gateway corridor below. Through these openings, defenders could once release stones, sand, or other materials if danger forced its way past the outer doors. They are narrow and easily missed unless someone points them out. Yet their presence changes the feeling of the space immediately. The gatehouse is not a single barrier. It is a sequence of pauses. A guard steps forward from the inner side of the passage as you approach. He does not raise his voice. Instead, He lifts the lantern slightly so its light reaches your face. For a moment he studies you without speaking, then he asks a single question. It is not your name, it is the password. Each night, a new word travels quietly through the castle before darkness settles fully across the walls. Messengers carry it from tower to courtyard, from gatehouse to stable yard, repeating it only to those whose duties require it. By morning, it will no longer be used. Tonight's word is spoken softly. The messenger beside you leans closer to the guard and whispers it so that no one farther down the corridor can hear. The guard nods once and steps aside, allowing both of you to pass through the second door into the inner yard beyond. Nothing about the exchange feels dramatic, yet the safety of the castle depends on moments like this. Passwords change not because danger is always expected, but because watchfulness is a habit that grows stronger through repetition. Even when no threat appears beyond the gate, the ritual continues. Behind you, the outer door closes again with a quiet wooden weight. Inside the gatehouse chamber, another guard checks the iron teeth of the portcullis that hangs above the passage. The heavy grid of metal remains raised for now, resting securely in its frame. If needed, it could be lowered quickly to block the entrance completely. He runs his hand along one of its bars, feeling for any sign of loosened fittings or shifting hinges. Maintenance like this happens often and without ceremony. The strength of a gate depends not only on its design, but on the patience of those who care for it through ordinary nights. Near the wall, a small brazier burns with low, steady coals. Its warmth reaches only a short distance, just enough to soften fingers stiffened by cold stone air. One guard pauses beside it briefly before returning to his place near the doorway. And even here, warmth must be borrowed carefully and then left behind again. Further along the corridor, a narrow staircase climbs upward toward the chamber above the gate. A second watcher waits there. From this higher position, he can see both the outer road and the inner courtyard at the same time. His task is not only to observe approaching travelers, but to listen for movement inside the gatehouse itself. The sound of a latch lifted too soon, or a step taken where none should be heard, can matter as much as any signal from outside the walls. Discipline during these hours is quiet but firm. A guard who sleeps while on watch risks more than embarrassment. In many castles, penalties for neglecting duty could include loss of pay, extra service hours, or removal from trusted positions altogether. And both the safety of everyone inside the walls depends on wakefulness shared carefully across the night. The messenger who spoke the password earlier now continues across the courtyard beyond the gatehouse. Behind him, the lantern light fades again inside the passage. Stone returns to shadow. Above the archway, the narrow openings remain silent and unseen, waiting only in case they are ever needed. Most nights they remain empty of movement, their purpose remembered rather than used. From outside the gate, the winter road stretches pale beneath the moon. From inside, the castle breathes slowly in its sleep. Between those two worlds stands the gatehouse, holding its careful watch through routine more than alarm, through habit more than fear. And as you step farther into the courtyard, where warmer lights glow behind shuttered windows, you begin to sense that far beyond these stone walls, in cities where markets open before sunrise instead of gates closing at dusk, people found other ways to guard their daily survival through the long winter season. Morning begins earlier in a Roman market than it does in most homes nearby. Long before the sun rises high enough to warm the upper walls of the city, footsteps already echo along narrow stone streets. Wooden shutters open one by one. Clay jars are lifted from storage shelves. A cart rolls slowly across the paving stones, its wheels sounding hollow in the cool air of dawn. By the time the sky begins turning pale above the rooftops, the market is awake. You enter through a narrow opening between buildings and find yourself standing in a courtyard surrounded by small shop fronts. These shops are called tabernae, simple rooms that open directly toward the street so that food and goods can pass easily from seller to customer without delay. Inside one of them, a vendor is already arranging olives in shallow trays. He moves them slowly with both hands, spreading them evenly so their dark surfaces catch the morning light. Some are green and firm, Others are darker and softer from long soaking in brine. He does not rush his work. He knows customers will begin arriving soon, and each tray must look inviting before the first voices fill the courtyard. In cities like this one, most households do not store large supplies of food at home. Apartments rise several stories high above the streets, and storage space inside them is limited. Instead of preparing meals days in advance, people walk to the market each morning and buy what they need for that day alone. Bread, fruit, fish, vegetables, and cooked dishes all move through these narrow spaces in steady streams, changing hands quickly but quietly. The market does not feel hurried. It feels continuous. Along one side of the courtyard, a baker carries a basket filled with round loaves still warm from the oven. The scent reaches you before the loaves themselves come into view. He places them carefully on a wooden counter, arranging them in rows so that each one can cool evenly before customers arrive to choose among them. Nearby, another vendor lifts a clay jar from the back of his stall and removes its lid. A sharp, salty scent drifts outward into the morning air. This is garum, a fermented fish sauce carried across the Roman world in sealed containers marked with painted labels showing where the contents were prepared. The scent is strong but familiar. For many people passing through the market, it signals not discomfort, but appetite. These jars travel long distances before reaching the city. Some arrive by ship, others by cart. Each carries markings that tell traders where the contents came from, and sometimes even which workshop prepared them. The painted letters on their surfaces guide buyers the same way road signs guide travelers outside the city walls. Fish sellers arrive early. They must. Before the sun climbs too high, fresh fish is laid across stone counters where customers can see its bright scales and clear eyes. The sellers sprinkle water lightly across the display so the surface remains cool and shining. As they work, small flashes of silver move in the light like ripples passing across a shallow stream. Coins begin changing hands. Voices grow louder. The courtyard fills slowly with movement. A woman carrying a woven basket pauses beside the olive stall and selects a handful to examine more closely. She presses one gently between her fingers before nodding and placing several into her basket. The exchange happens quickly without long discussion. She already knows what she needs. Most customers do. Daily shopping creates a rhythm that repeats itself so often it becomes almost invisible. Each person arrives with a purpose. Each leaves with only what can be carried comfortably through the streets before returning home again. Along the outer edge of the market, another taberna prepares hot food for those who do not cook at home. Inside, a shallow metal pan rests above a charcoal fire. Steam rises slowly from its surface, carrying the scent of herbs into the courtyard. A man waiting nearby warms his hands briefly over the edge before accepting a small portion placed into a clay bowl. Food here moves the way water moves through a channel. It does not remain still for long. Across the courtyard, stacks of amphorae stand upright beside a wall where traders have placed them carefully in rows. Their narrow necks and rounded bodies allow them to rest securely against one another. Each carries markings showing its origin, sometimes painted in red or black along the clay surface. Together they form a quiet map of the wider Roman world. Oil from one region, and wine from another, fish sauce from distant coasts, grain from inland farms, all meeting here in a single morning exchange of voices and goods. The olive vendor finishes arranging his trays and steps back for a moment to study the display. The courtyard has grown brighter now. More footsteps echo across the paving stones. More baskets appear along the walkways. He reaches forward once more and adjusts a single olive near the edge of the tray so it will not roll away when the next customer arrives. Around him, the market continues opening like a slow tide rising through the streets of the city. And as you stand there watching goods pass from hand to hand with quiet certainty, you begin to understand that these markets are not only places where people buy food, they are places where a city learns how to remain alive together each day. As the morning grows brighter across the market courtyard, the rhythm of exchange begins to change. Earlier, the space filled slowly with footsteps and the careful placing of goods onto counters. Now, voices begin to gather as well. They rise and settle in overlapping layers, like the sound of water moving through many narrow channels at once. The market is no longer only opening, it is speaking. Near the olive stall, two customers pause beside a tray of figs arranged in careful rows. One of them lifts a small balance scale from the counter and places a handful of fruit onto its shallow metal plate. The vendor watches quietly, while the other plate is adjusted with small weights until both sides settle evenly. No one rushes this moment. Agreement depends on patience. The customer removes one fig and then replaces another slightly larger one before nodding in satisfaction. Coins pass from hand to hand. The exchange is complete without raised voices or long discussion. Bargaining here rarely feels like argument. It feels more like listening together for the point where both sides are comfortable. Around them, similar conversations unfold across the courtyard. A basket of herbs changes owners beside a doorway. A bundle of onions moves from a wooden crate into a woven sack. A jar of oil is lifted carefully, examined in the light, and returned to the counter before another jar is chosen instead. Each movement adds another layer to the sound of the market. Coins strike softly against one another. Wooden lids close over clay containers. Sandaled footsteps pass across stone in steady patterns. Even without looking, you could follow the progress of the morning simply by listening. But the market carries more than goods. It carries news. At the edge of the courtyard, a small group has gathered near a baker's stall where fresh loaves continue to arrive from the ovens behind the street. Someone speaks quietly about a shipment of grain delayed along the river road. Another repeats a rumor about repairs planned for a nearby bathhouse. A third describes a message posted earlier near the forum, steps announcing a public gathering later in the week. None of these announcements travel through official messengers alone. They move through markets. In cities where thousands of people share the same narrow streets, information spreads most quickly where people already gather for daily needs. A sentence spoken beside a bread stall may reach the opposite end of the city before midday arrives. Even those who say little are listening. Nearby, a boy moves carefully through the crowd, carrying a shallow basket filled with small cups. He pauses beside several customers before continuing onward again. Some accept the cups, others wave him past. His path bends naturally through the busiest parts of the courtyard, guided by the movement of people rather than any fixed route. Markets teach their own directions. Along the outer wall, a merchant watches the crowd with quiet attention. He stands beside a row of amphorae marked with painted letters that show where the oil inside them was prepared. His task is not only to sell the contents, it is also to protect them. In crowded spaces like this one, and small objects sometimes disappear quickly if no one is watching closely. Petty theft is not common enough to stop trade, but it is common enough to expect. The merchant shifts one amphora slightly closer to the wall, narrowing the space where someone might pass unnoticed behind it. The adjustment is small, almost invisible, yet it reflects the same habit of watchfulness that shaped the castle gatehouse far away in another land. Protection does not always require walls. Sometimes it requires attention. Across the courtyard, another stall displays folded cloth arranged in neat layers along a wooden bench. The colors vary from deep red to pale brown, depending on the dyes available that season. A woman pauses there, touching the surface of one piece before comparing it with another. Her clothing shows that she must choose carefully. Yet some fabrics remain beyond her reach. Others fall within it. The market makes these differences visible without needing explanation. Wealth and limitation stand side by side here, as naturally as baskets and scales. Yet even where differences exist, cooperation continues. Groups of merchants often work together to maintain standards for weights and measures, so customers know what to expect when they return the next day. These associations help reduce confusion and strengthen trust between sellers who share the same narrow streets. Trust makes the market possible. Without it, exchange would slow. As the morning continues, another voice rises near the center of the courtyard, repeating news carried from the forum earlier in the day. Several listeners turn their heads slightly to hear more clearly. Within moments, the message begins traveling outward again, through smaller conversations that move toward the surrounding streets. Information flows here as steadily as food. It passes from one person to another without needing to remain in one place for long. The customer weighing figs earlier now places them carefully into a basket before stepping back into the movement of the crowd. His path leads him past the olive stall, past the baker's counter, and toward a narrow street where sunlight has begun reaching the paving stones more strongly than before. Behind him, the market continues speaking in many voices at once, and as you listen to those voices blending together across the courtyard, you begin to recognize that even in cities far from winter plains and northern halls, its survival still depends less on strength alone than on the quiet cooperation that carries people through each ordinary day together. By now, you have walked through several kinds of winter. Each one felt different. Yet each one asked the same question in its own quiet way. How do people remain safe when the season grows long and uncertain? The answer never depended on a single invention. It depended on patterns repeated carefully across generations, patterns shaped by land, weather, memory, and cooperation. As evening returns once more to the open plains, those patterns begin to gather together, like distant lights appearing one by one across the sky. In the north, a longhouse fire continues burning through the deepest part of the year. People sit beside it, not only for warmth, but for reassurance that darkness has limits. Evergreen branches hang above them. Oaths spoken beside the hearth carry promises forward into seasons not yet visible. The return of sunlight may still be slow, but it is already expected. Farther south, above stone gates and frozen courtyards, another kind of fire glows inside small iron braziers along castle walls. Guards move carefully through the night, listening for footsteps that should not be there. Their watchfulness protects people who never see them walking along the towers overhead. Even when nothing happens, the watch continues, dividing the darkness into quiet portions marked by the sound of bells. In crowded cities warmed by early morning sunlight, markets open their doors before most households finish waking. There, survival depends on movement rather than stillness. Old bread travels from ovens to baskets. Oil moves from amphorae into clay cups. News passes from voice to voice more quickly than any written notice could carry it. Each exchange strengthens the invisible threads that hold the city together. And here, on the plains once again, a familiar shape rises from the snow. 3 long poles meet at their upper ends and lean together until the frame steadies itself against the wind. One by one, the remaining poles join them. A covering unfolds across the structure, settling into place with the same quiet certainty it has carried through many winters before. Inside, the fire returns to the center. Warmth begins its slow journey outward once more. A family gathers beside the embers as evening light fades across the horizon. Someone adjusts a folded hide near the liner wall. Someone else places a small bundle of tools above the sleeping circle where the air remains dry. These movements feel ordinary because they have been repeated so many times before, yet they belong to the same story you have followed across forests, castles, and markets: shelter, ritual, watchfulness, exchange. Each culture shaped these ideas differently, but none lived without them. If you imagine looking down from far above the earth on this same winter evening, you might see 4 small fires glowing in different places across the continents. One burns inside a hide-covered shelter on the plains. Another shines through the doorway of a northern hall. A third flickers beside a stone tower overlooking frozen fields. A fourth reflects in polished jars along a city market street, where people prepare tomorrow's meals. They are far apart, yet they answer the same cold sky. The Plains family settles closer together as the fire strengthens again inside their shelter. A child leans against a rolled bundle of bedding while listening to the low voices of the adults nearby. Outside, the wind moves gently across the snow, touching the curved walls without entering. The shelter breathes, the warmth spreads, and the circle that formed earlier in the day closes again around those who depend on it. In the longhouse far to the north, candles burn lower now as conversation slows beside the hearth. In the castle tower, a guard pauses once more beside the brazier before continuing his round. In the Roman market, shutters close gradually as the last customers return home with baskets filled for the evening meal. Each place moves toward rest in its own way, and each place carries its own memory of how to continue. Winter does not disappear, but people learn how to live within it. As the fire inside the shelter settles into a steady glow once more, its light touches the curved walls gently and returns again toward the center where the family sits together in quiet conversation. And there, inside that circle of warmth, something familiar is waiting again: the shelter itself. Night has returned to the plains again. The shelter stands where it stood before, its tall poles steady beneath the quiet weight of the winter sky. Snow rests lightly along the lower edges of the covering, not pressing inward, but leaning gently against the outer surface as though the land itself has come closer for warmth. Inside, the fire has changed. It no longer rises in bright flames that reach toward the smoke opening above. Instead, it settles into a bed of red coals that glow steadily at the center of the floor. Their light moves slowly across the curved walls, touching the liner before returning again toward the sleeping circle arranged along the edge of the shelter. Nothing inside the tipi feels hurried now. The air has grown calmer. The warmth has grown deeper. You notice how evenly it spreads along the wall, where bedding rests in a wide circle around the fire. The liner still guides the movement of air in quiet patterns, holding the warmth near the ground where people sleep, while allowing cooler air to rise gently upward through the opening above. The shelter continues breathing, not loudly, not noticeably, but steadily enough that everyone inside trusts it without needing to think about how it works. Along the perimeter, blankets have already been drawn closer around shoulders and feet. The layered mats beneath them soften the frozen ground, creating a surface that holds warmth gathered through the evening. Boots that dried earlier beside the fire now rest farther from the embers, ready for morning travel if it becomes necessary again. Nothing has been left unfinished. Near the center, one final piece of wood settles inward as its outer edge darkens and folds quietly into the glowing coals beneath it. A faint sound follows, almost like a breath drawn slowly and released again. A child lying close to the liner wall watches the movement of the embers for a moment longer before closing his eyes. He has listened to the evening stories already. He has watched the boots drying beside the fire. He has heard the wind moving across the outer covering without entering. Now, he no longer needs to remain awake. Beside him, an older voice continues speaking softly, though the words have grown slower and farther apart. Conversation does not end suddenly inside the shelter. It fades gradually, like the sound of footsteps moving away across snow. Outside, the wind changes direction once more. Its movement touches the hide covering with a gentle shifting sound that travels along the surface before disappearing again into the darkness beyond the camp. The poles remain steady. The seams remain closed. The liner continues guiding warmth along the edge where everyone rests. The shelter answers the wind without resisting it. It simply holds its shape. Above, a narrow thread of smoke rises through the opening at the top and disappears into the cold air beneath the stars. The opening remains small enough to protect the warmth below, yet wide enough to keep the air clear for breathing through the night. Even this balance continues without effort now. It has already been prepared. Across the sleeping circle, someone turns slightly beneath a folded hide and then becomes still again. Another shifts closer to the warmth along the wall where the air feels most steady. These movements are small and familiar, part of a rhythm repeated across many winters before this one. The fire continues breathing quietly at the center. Its light no longer reaches every corner of the shelter at once. Instead, it moves slowly, touching one place and then another, and like a voice speaking gently across the circle before falling silent again. Outside the tipi, the night stretches wide across the plains. Inside, the warmth remains gathered close. The child beside the liner wall breathes more slowly now. His hands rest loosely against the folded edge of a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and dry grass. Somewhere nearby, another sleeper shifts once, and then settles again into stillness. Nothing else needs to happen tonight. The shelter is already doing its work. The fire is already holding its place. The wind is already passing without entering. And as the last coal settles deeper into the center of the hearth, and the circle of sleepers grows quieter with each passing breath, you begin to feel how many generations have listened to this same gentle sound before falling asleep beneath the same steady shelter. Checklist for this session. Length: approximately 950 words. Calm cadence with continuous transitions. Yes, clear sensory anchors. Ember glow at center hearth. Liner-guided warmth along wall edges. Hide surface shifting under wind. Smoke thread rising through roof opening. Gentle fact-based humor. Present in the observation that the shelter continues working even after everyone stops thinking about how it works. Metaphor use: sound-based imagery applied through breathing embers, fading conversation, and wind across hide walls. Concrete historical details included: overnight ember heat strategy, liner-controlled airflow circulation, perimeter sleeping warmth zones. At smoke flap ventilation balance, bias, or uncertainty noted, where relevant. Acknowledges variation among plains communities in liner use and interior arrangement. Character vignette included: child drifting to sleep beside hearth after evening storytelling, soft curiosity hook included. Transition into final wind-down reflection of shared human continuity across centuries. Lexicon variation applied. Repeated shelter terminology, avoided vignettes used. Child settling into sleep beside liner wall near ember glow. Facts integrated, liner airflow insulation, perimeter sleeping zones, ember-based overnight heating practice. Hook line: many generations have listened to this same gentle sound before falling asleep beneath the same steady shelter. This section is complete, and so we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, thank you for keeping me company here, among worn stones, warm embers, and the small brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watch.